So we will stop recording a few times during this when we're having some discussions, but otherwise this session will be recorded so you can revisit it if you need to. And we will also share the resources for it. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining today. This is our second class covering pre-award. Like Hillary did last week, I've split this into two topic groupings. So the first will briefly cover funding agency registrations, and then we'll do a deeper dive into biosketches and other support. And the second one today, we'll talk about budgets and allowable costs. And it's not advancing, so give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, we'll start today with funding agency registrations, and we're going to start with a few very brief polls. So the first one is, does your institution have a SAM identifier? And so if you can answer this, you should see the poll pop up on your screen. This is something you were supposed to check as your homework, but if you didn't get a chance to, or you aren't sure what a SAM identifier is, no problem, hang in there. We'll have that discussion in just a few moments. So it looks like a lot of people have one. Some do not know if they have one. All right. Okay, thank you so much. We'll stop there. And it looks like a majority of people have one, about a third, not sure if they have one or not for their institution. Let's move to the next question. So does your institution have a DUNS number? So yes or no? Did you happen to look this up, and do you know if you have a DUNS number? Okay. All right, one more, hang in there with me. We have one more poll to do. Yeah, there we go. All right, is your institution registered in grants.gov, your organization? And I suspect that some of you who are answering yes are the ones who are responsible for doing these registrations. And so others of you who may not know may not be the ones responsible for doing this for your institution. Okay, that's helpful. All right, thank you all. We're going to stop there. So I want to just talk briefly about these. And as Hillary mentioned last week, your organization has to be registered in multiple systems in order to apply for a grant through the NIH or other US federal agencies. So it's very important for you to know who from your institution is responsible for doing this. This registration has to be done on behalf of the entire organization, and it's ideal not to duplicate these, as it causes a lot of problems for funding agencies to figure out where to award funds if your institution has multiple DUNS numbers or multiple SAMs. So the DUNS number that you see at the top here, this is a unique 9-digit ID that your organization will have. It's used for all of the other registrations. So you have to have this in place if you're going to apply for grants, or if you're going to register in any of these other systems. So the US government is moving away from this third-party identifier, and they're moving to this unique entity identifier. They're calling it a UE by April of 2022. You can find out more on that website. SAM registration is required for any organization that is applying for a grant or contract. So if you answered, I don't know, but your institution has gotten a grant before, you are registered in SAM, or you were at one point. It's important that this takes a little bit longer. This is one of the longer registrations, and it does need to be renewed annually. So if you haven't done it yet, or if you have an older one that is expired and you've looked in the system like you were supposed to do for your homework, then, and it says you're expired, then make sure that it gets renewed. And that also can take a little bit of time, although it's faster than the initial registration. Grants.gov at the bottom here is a website where you can find and apply to funding opportunities. Hillary showed you this last week. Organizations and individuals registered to submit grants through this website. And so you can see, as Hillary showed you, you can search all the different funding opportunities, but that's also one of the areas where you can apply to grants directly. The registration for all of these systems is free, and there's detailed guidance available online. There are very detailed tutorials that really walk you through the steps. And so I'll put those in the resources for the class this week so that you'll have that. This website gets you started and it allows you to check to see if your institution has a DUNS number and if it's registered in SAM. If it is, you will already have that UE, the unique entity identifier, will already have been assigned. And so if you register moving forward, you'll automatically get one. ERA Commons, so this is something we talked about a bit about last week. So you need 2 registrations here. Your organization must be registered to be able to receive funds, and individual investigators who are applying for grants must also be registered. You have an individual profile that you set up for each person. It's called an ERA Commons ID. This is a unique identifier and it tracks all of your funding and reporting. So prior to now, ERA Commons IDs were only required for principal investigators on grants. Beginning in January of 2022, they'll be required for all key personnel on grants. So as I mentioned, this is the way you track your applications through the review process. Investigators can see study section rosters, so you know who the review committee will be. And this is how you view the grant scores, the summary statements, and how you submit your progress reports each year. So you as an administrator should be affiliated with your organization and you'll be assigned a role. So there are certain roles like AO, which is administrative officer. And if you can have someone designate you in this role, then you can actually search for ERA Commons IDs across your institution and create them for others. It's a very fast process to create an ERA Commons ID, but you need to make sure, again, that we aren't duplicating individuals in a system. If someone is already in the system, but affiliated with a different university or institution, you can just change their affiliation. So it's important to know who in your organization has the privileges to create these ERA Commons IDs, especially given the increasing need for all personnel to have them. So additional registrations that we won't talk about today, but we will talk about in GAIN Course 2, the post-award course, include things like the payment management system, which is required for grants recipients. We won't cover that today, though. So additionally, as part of your homework this week, you should have attempted to set up a profile through login.gov. And this is another one that I'll put those step-by-step instructions that you can link to here. This is the US government's new platform to access a number of the systems that are needed by grantees, including moving forward as of January. This is the way that the only way people will be able to log in to ERA Commons. So NIH is phasing in this 2-factor authentication program. And so the goal is to fully transition by early 2022. So if you haven't set up a username and password through login.gov yet, please do so. As I mentioned, we'll put the tutorials with the screenshots and the videos to walk you through the processes. And these will be all provided in the resources for this section. After you've done it yourself, then you'll be experienced and you'll be able to walk others through this, because all of your investigators, again, anyone who needs to access ERA Commons will need to do this. And so by being an expert, it will really help your institution move forward. So this section was first and fastest of the presentation. You may not have questions until you actually try to log in and do these things. If you have questions about registrations, please let me know now. Go ahead and put them in the chat or chime in if you have them. And otherwise, we'll move on to bio sketches.
So Donna, Beatrice put a comment in the chat saying, unfortunately, I had to delete my account because of authenticator issues. That was the only option that you received at login.gov. And I haven't heard that where they make you delete your account.
I have not heard that either. I know that they have some problems with outside of the US with the authentication systems. They've been trying to fix some of the bugs in that system because they're trying to roll this out more broadly. So I would definitely advise you to try again. They also have a very responsive, a surprisingly responsive for the US government help desk that I will also put in the resources so that you can ask them directly if you continue to have issues. So,
She said, thank you.
yeah.
Thanks, Beatrice.
Okay, so we're going to move on to biosketches. And there are, last week, Hillary talked about the various parts of a grant lifecycle, and she outlined some of the components of a grant submission. So we're going to do a deep dive this week to focus on one of the components of every NIH grant submission, and that's biosketches. So I want to start with what I think are three very important points about biosketches, and one of the reasons at least that we're including them in this topic in our GAIN course. So the first is that biosketches are a component of grants that research administrators are often asked to assist with, to either help create them or to ensure that they're compliant. It's very importantly, the quality of a biosketch and the compliance of a biosketch can significantly impact the grant score. And the third thing that I want to mention is that you don't have to be a scientist to help create or ensure that a biosketch is compliant. So research administrators can play a large role in this. A lot of investigators, in fact, some of the strongest scientists I know really struggle with biosketches and being able to do these well. So this is really where a research administrator can play a critical role. So hopefully you were able to read the pre-course materials that described a bit about biosketches and how to create one. I know some of the materials were a bit dense, and I promise this was not just to make this lecture look better by comparison. But I'm going to briefly review a few of the highlights from the pre-course materials here. So the first is, what is a biosketch? And so in short, this is a way for reviewers to assess whether or not the applicant can actually carry out the work they've proposed. So it serves as the primary tool for reviewers to learn about an applicant's education and training, their research strengths, expertise and funding that is relevant to the project they're proposing, relationships with other investigators who they're proposing to work with on this project, and then professional roles and important accomplishments they've had throughout their career. So who needs to submit a biosketch for the application you're submitting? The answer for this is anyone who's listed on the grant as a senior or key person, as well as anyone who's listed in that other significant contributors category. So when you submit a grant, you have to drop down what everyone's role is. And so the people who fall under this other significant contributors category are also considered key personnel and need to submit a grant. So this includes the PI. If you have multiple PIs, you need one for every person, any co-investigators, and any consultants. And this includes even if they're at no effort on the project. So you may share the same question as this gentleman. So why not use a CV or resume? These are commonly available. They're used for other faculty purposes. Everyone has one. It seems like this would be an easy thing to just submit. But they have a method to their madness. So if you have looked at a number of CVs, especially for more senior faculty, you know that they tend to be very long. I have personally seen some in excess of 100 pages. And so the NIH BioSketch is specifically designed to provide the information the reviewers are most interested in, the information most relevant to the project being proposed, and keep it all within a 5-page limit so that the reviewers can actually go through and find the important things. Importantly, this format dictates how long each of the individual sections can be as well, and what can be included. And so today we're going to talk about the type of biosketch that is utilized by the NIH. It's also increasingly utilized by other funding entities, and you can use this template to modify for other shorter CV versions like USAID, CDC, some of the other US organizations that fund research often require like a 2-page bio. And it's much easier to shorten a biosketch to a 2-page bio than to start from a CV each time. So how can a biosketch be so important that it would actually impact a grant score? So the NIH applications, for those of you who are not aware, these are generally scored in 5 primary areas, and you can see them listed here: significance, investigator, innovation, environment, and approach. So each of these are important because a low score in any one of these areas can be the difference between funded and not funded, and any non-compliance in any of these areas can even prevent an application from even going to review and being discussed. So biosketches can be your biggest asset, but then also one of your biggest liabilities in achieving a high score for this investigator section because they convince the reviewer that the investigative team is actually qualified to do the work. So an improperly formatted biosketch, it's important to note, can cause an application to be rejected before it is reviewed. Right, so none of us want to be in a situation where we and our investigators have put in a ton of work to submit this application, only to have the NIH do what they call administratively withdraw it because it's improperly formatted. So it's easy to avoid by following the biosketch guidelines, but the biosketch guidelines are always changing. So go directly to the source anytime you're going to submit, especially if you have not submitted for a while. You can see the website here, and that will make sure that you have the most up-to-date template and the most current guidance. So we're only going to be talking in today's class about the biosketch template that is required for applications beginning in late January of 2022. Most institutions have already transitioned to this because they know it's coming up. And so this is definitely what you'll want to use going forward. You can see here the basics for what should be included in a biosketch. The total document should be 5 pages or less. You do not want to include these instructions that you can see here. If a biosketch is not already translated into English, please make sure you find someone fluent to translate it accurately. I've seen a number of them translated by Google Translate or other machine translations, and they're not the best options. There's a big difference between a reviewer who reads a biosketch that says, I was on an NIH grant versus I have led multiple NIH grants. And so these are some of the things that a machine translation might not pick up. So we're going to talk about some of the additional formatting rules in detail, but when you're going through a biosketch, you want to make sure to have all of the language in first person. So talking about, so the PI should say, I did this and here are my accomplishments versus Dr. So-and-so did this thing. Size 11 point font and the 1/2 inch margin on all sides. That's the same for all of the formatting throughout an NIH proposal. And so this is the same for the biosketches as well. One of the things that we see come up most often when we have biosketches from our international partners is that they come on an A4 format instead of the standard US 8.5 by 11 letter size. So then when it's converted to the 8.5 by 11, you end up losing some of the text or not having room for everything. So make sure you're using the right format. If you did your homework this week, and I'm hoping you did, you obtained a CV or resume from a faculty member with whom you work. And so this could be anywhere from 3 pages long to 300. And so we're going to go through a few of the next steps together to talk about how you would convert this from a CV to a biosketch. So we're going to start here with the first part of the bio. This is the most straightforward. I mean, you will always find this to be the easiest because you can essentially copy and paste this directly from the person's CV. This is their name, their position, and their education and training. When you're doing this, so you can capitalize the person's last name to clarify. Sometimes the reviewers really like if it's clear what the person's last name is. Hillary mentioned the ERA Commons IDs last week. We talked about them a little bit earlier. As I mentioned, these will be required beginning in January for all key personnel, so that will have to be included here. When you list current position titles, consultant, associate professor, whatever it may be, you may also list the department and the institution. So an example might be consultant in neurology at Aminu Kano Teaching Hospital. And the position will be captured again below in section B. So you just want to make sure that those match up. So for training, one of the things that we see most often is that people include training prior to college or university level. So you don't want to do that. So begin with the degree granting university, college level degrees and go from there. So workshops, minor certificate programs, things like that will be captured later. So this should really capture the major formal training programs. So section A is one part of the biosketch that likely needs to be drafted by the investigator as opposed to a research administrator, because it is specific to their career growth and experience, and they're most qualified to speak to that. But it's important that this section be very strong and tailored to the project. And so this is something where you can help them review it and understand what they're really trying to present. Because again, this can influence that reviewer investigator score that you need to have a high score on. And so it's helpful if you can see, when you're doing this for the first time, if you can see other examples, it's very helpful. There are examples available online, but also don't hesitate to ask another colleague or an administrator in the game network for an example that they might have used in a recent application, because that's a really big benefit. I'll go through a few of the key points here. So this section should be brief, it should be factual. You don't want to have a lot of overlap throughout your bio sketch. It should highlight the person's training, their research experience, and any other qualifications specific to the project. So leadership, administrative, mentoring responsibilities. Mentioning that the person has previously been awarded NIH grants or has led other research independently is a big plus. And then if there are any gaps in productivity, if the person stepped away from their research career for any period of time, that can be addressed here, but again, brief, a single sentence is sufficient. And then at the end, there's a section now where you can include recent relevant grants and up to 4 relevant publications. So importantly, there used to be a section D on bio sketches in the old format. Some of you may be familiar with this if you've been in the business for a while, and it listed all of the completed and ongoing support for each PI. This section is gone now. The new BioSketch format does not have that, but you can cut and paste relevant completed and ongoing grants into section A. And the reviewers really have not loved it if you just copy all of section D and put it in section A. They really want to see the relevant grants to the project that you're doing. And so finally, I wanted to draw your attention to a few things about this section and throughout the BioSketch. URLs and hyperlinks and graphics and figures are absolutely not allowed. And so this will cause an application to be actually withdrawn. So please make sure that if there are any hyperlinks or graphics or figures in your BioSketch, that you remove those before submitting. I want to show some of the key attributes of personal statements. I've highlighted them in red in this example. It may be small on your screen, and I apologize, and hopefully you can look at it with the slides that you see later. This investigator gave a few very brief comments at the beginning about her overall research portfolio and training. She mentions that she's had leadership roles overseeing NIH-funded projects. And there's a quick mention of the gap in her research productivity due to family obligations. So in a single paragraph, she's addressed all of the researchers or the reviewers' potential concerns about her experience, her training, her ability to do the work that she's proposed. And then below, you can see here how she's highlighted 2 ongoing R01 level grants or recent grants that are related to this project. And she has 4 publications here that really highlight her strength in this area. And this just demonstrates her credibility with her peers. So moving on to section B, this is something that you should be able to complete based on the CV that you've obtained. So you don't necessarily need the researcher to do this. So this is where they list all the positions, the scientific appointments, and their honors. It needs to be in reverse chronological order. So start with the most recent things first. And depending on how the CV you have is organized, you might need to combine some items from a few different areas. So they might list out positions in one place and different appointments and scientific committees and things like that in different sections of the resume or CV. So make sure you pull them all together for section B. So this should include any academic, professional, or institutional appointments. It doesn't matter if they're full-time, part-time, voluntary, compensated, not compensated, they all go into this section. It might include special service to organizations, study section membership, awards, honors received, adjunct visiting, honorary appointments. It should also include scholarships and fellowships, especially for more recent faculty. And then for clinicians, you want to make sure you have clinical licensures, board certifications, and specializations. Do not include anything that was prior to university college level training. You don't want to have old things from secondary school on here. So So here's an example of what a section B might look like. And you can see the reverse chronological order. So the most recent positions are listed first. You can see that the institutions or organizations are listed as well. So for this example, Washington University, St. Louis, Missouri. So this is important because it helps the reviewer understand the magnitude of the position or honor or award. So is it something that was awarded at an institutional level, at a national level, at an international level? You can also see that this person has included her memberships in professional societies, scientific societies, editorial roles, consultancies, and then obviously her standard academic appointments. This position or this section has not changed significantly from the previous forms if you've done this before. The final section of the bio sketch, because remember now we only have A, B, and C, there is no more part B. So the final section of the bio sketch, section C, is called Contributions to Science, which may sound like it overlaps a bit with the personal statement that we covered previously. But the personal statement should focus on the investigator and their qualifications for the project. And the contributions to science should really speak to the accomplishments across their career. So not necessarily just related to this project, but everything they've done that makes them a qualified scientist. So these contributions can range from bench scientists or bench science to clinical care, health policy, advocacy, anything that they've really accomplished in their professional career. So for each one, they should have a short paragraph for each contribution. This almost always needs the investigator's input, at least the first time it's created. And then from there, it's often possible for a research administrator to update or change it to fit a new application. So junior faculty, so 5 contributions is the maximum limit in this section. Junior faculty may have fewer, and those new to research might have fewer, and that's absolutely okay. For publications listed in section C and in section A, any publications in your bio sketch, you have to include what's called a PubMed Central ID number if one is available. PMC ID is how you'll see that abbreviated. This is all affiliated with the NIH policy for public access compliance. We'll cover that more in the GAIN post-award course when we talk about compliance for awards. But basically the purpose is to make sure that data collected by NIH studies are available to the public. So to review, you can have as many as 5 contributions, and you can have 4 publications for each contribution. So this section should have no more than 20 references. This is something where the investigators often will list 12 per contribution. And so you often will have to work with them to cut that down, find the most relevant ones for their application. As a reminder, no hyperlinks or graphics or figures, but after the contributions to science, you can have a single line that says, here is a link to the bibliography for this person that includes all of their published work. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. That's the only exception to the URLs or links. Go ahead, Anne.
I just wanted to point out there was a great question from Daphne in the chat related to this. And previously we did actually include hyperlinks to the paper under the PMC ID. So you're saying that with this new format, they don't want to see any of that anymore.
Nope, not allowed anymore. The only URLs or hyperlinks can be this my NCBI bibliography now. Okay. And previously, if some of you have done this before, it was include a PMC ID, or if that's not available, include a PMID or a DOI or something like that. Now they're saying just PMC ID if you have it, and otherwise don't worry about it. Where you used to have that URL available there, the reason they've really gotten away from that is that they had too many people who were saying they were clicking on things, or they were worried about security with clicking on links that were going to external sites. And so if you put in something like that, you aren't allowed to hyperlink it or make it into a URL of any sort. So.
I mean, really, that makes it easier on us.
Sure, yeah. Less easier on the reviewers who are trying to find the papers, but that's on them. Okay. So here's an example of what a section C might look like. And you can see that the PI has listed 2 contributions to science, not 5. Because if you remember back to the personal statement, she's quite junior, and she also mentioned stepping away from research for a while due to family obligations. So that even further justifies having only 2 contributions listed. I can tell you that having fewer strong ones is better than having many small, insignificant ones. So I've highlighted in red a few key items. You'll see in contribution 1 listed here that she uses phrases like these publications found and this body of work has changed the standards of care. So she's clearly talking about her accomplishments and not just herself. So this differs from the personal statement in section A. In the final sentence of the paragraph, she also, mentions her role in these NIH grants. So she serves as a primary investigator or co-investigator on this project. So that's great. She also lists 4 publications here, and she's listed her name in bold, as you can see, to just further emphasize her active role in the study as a first author or as a senior author on these publications. So I've also highlighted in this contribution 1B, the PMC ID number, so you can see how she's listed them out, how they're typically listed. There are no PMC IDs listed for these first 3, which likely means that the journal isn't indexed in PubMed, and we'll talk about that in a moment. At the very bottom, you'll see that she's also included the allowed link to her complete list of published work in MyNCBI. You can see what that looks like right there. And you can see that is the only URL that she has in this document. So for everyone's sake, I am not going to go into depth on database tools and searching today, but I did want to highlight PubMed. We've just briefly mentioned it. And so this is something that's managed by the National Library of Medicine and the US National Center for Biotechnology Information. So this is NCBI. And this is a great way to search publications on a topic or publications related to an individual, but it's also how you can find out if a publication has a PMC ID number. And so I've highlighted here, so here's the link, and I've highlighted here, this is an example. So you type in the search terms here, and then, in this case, I just included one of our investigators and then clicked on one of his papers. And you can see in purple, that's where you would find a PMC ID number. So you can practice on your own time with the CV that you secured from your investigator, but it's helpful to look here and find out if they have PMC ID numbers that should be included. There are also tools that can make building and maintaining biosketches much easier. So we're not going to go into these in much detail during this course, but we will post additional resources and guidance if you want to learn more about this. I encourage you to do so if you do support PIs with the biosketch creation frequently. It can make your life so much easier. And the tools that are available really walk you right through how to create a profile and how to set up bios in there and how to convert them. It's wonderful, but it makes updating a biosketch just a few clicks versus having to start over and delete and rewrite. So the role of the NCBI, as I just talked about, their role is to provide information and access to resources that are for and from NIH funded research. So this includes PubMed, and this, as I mentioned, is a primary access point for investigators to search and view publications. But within NCBI, you can personalize this dashboard called My NCBI. This allows you to create an individual bibliography that can be made public so that you can put it in a link in a biosketch. When we discuss compliance in GAIN Course 2, we'll talk about NIH public access compliance related to grants and how My NCBI can help with this. But this My NCBI link here, like I mentioned, the one that you'll create using this platform is the same one that you use at the end of the biosketch in section C, and it makes it very easy to collect all of those publications in one place. However, you can also use the bibliography set up in My NCBI to link to what's called Science CV. This is a tool that can be used to create and format biosketches. You can create multiple profiles and save and modify them for each investigator. This can really cut out work on your part, especially with regard to formatting. Science CV will alert you if the biosketch you're creating is in an old format, or if the one that exists is an old format. It can convert it to a new format for you. If you're working with a different US funding agency, it can it can convert from an NIH format to one that can be used for example, for the National Science Foundation. So if you'll be creating and managing biosketches regularly, or even fairly frequently, and if you're doing this for a number of investigators, please look at these additional resources that we will include to learn about Science CV and MyNCBI and just make your life easier. It takes a little bit more time to initially set up, and then afterwards, it's much easier for all of the submissions after that. So it's worth investing that time. And it can, as I mentioned, make sure that you always have the most current format. So that's the end of the BioSketch section. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. I appreciate those of you who have been chiming in with questions. Are there any others before we move on to other support? Okay, hearing none, we're going to keep going. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say there aren't any questions in the chat. And I just wanted to briefly share, I know that when I was getting into grant administration, I found this really overwhelming to see all of the different websites, all of the different organization registrations, and then all of the different things that an investigator needs to do. I just think that you've really laid these slides out well. And I would just encourage, if anyone is feeling that way, I know I definitely did, to just go through each slide, taking it one at a time. Go to that website, you know, see if your organization is registered, see if your investigators are registered, and just, you know, the big picture can be a little intimidating, but taking it one step at a time, I found to be, you know, really helpful. And then before you know it, none of these acronyms are intimidating and you know them all and you're familiar with them. So just wanted to share that. But
thank you. That's absolutely right. And I think the same for jumping in on BioSketches. Try and create one with the CV that you have. And I understand that you won't likely be able to, you know, speak to their personal statement, but just try and draft the sections of one. It's helpful if you do this when you don't need to, because when you need to, and someone is saying, oh, we need a BioSketch for this person, it's usually fairly urgent, because that is something that investigators tend to push off to the side as just not something they either know about or want to focus on when they're trying to create the science for a proposal. And so it gets brushed to the side a bit. And then it only becomes important when they see the reviewer scores and the reviewer said, well, this person didn't look to be qualified to do the work. And so, or if they have an issue and they say, well, we need a BioSketch, and it takes a long time to get one set up the first time. So do practice it when you don't need to do it, because that really does help get you comfortable with it. And like Anne said, you go through it and then pretty soon it's very routine. So, all right, we are going to move on to the last step on our road for this section. We're moving on to other support. So the NIH is funded by US taxpayer dollars. So this means their budget has to be approved annually by the US Congress. And as one might expect, increasing political pressures have resulted in the need for NIH to really increase the amount of information they collect from grant recipients to be able to show that the money is being spent appropriately, and no foreign governments have what they term undue influence over the US government portfolio and priorities. Also, they're trying to restrict access to sensitive proprietary technology, especially military-related technology and other findings. So the three main concerns of the NIH in managing their funding related to research integrity, or in overall managing their funding, relate to research integrity, overlap, and financial conflict of interest. So you might have heard of high-profile issues, at least in the US in recent years, where financial conflicts of interest were inappropriately reported. This led to a lot of scandals, quite frankly, dismissals and penalties for top US institutions, articles in Science about it. And so there are financial conflict of interest forms and other documentation that institutions collect and report. These will be covered in post-award. And so we won't talk about that right now. But for the second one, other support documentation is the primary way that the NIH really assesses the second concern here, so overlap. This is primarily assessed by the other support documentation. So if you aren't familiar with the term other support, this is a document that's required to be submitted to the NIH periodically for every investigator on a project. So when a grant receives a fundable score, the NIH program staff reach out to request what is called just-in-time or JIT documentation. This includes other support documents for all key personnel. There are a few exceptions. We will discuss them in just a moment. Other support is also required with the annual Research Progress Performance Report, RPPR, or the final Research Progress Performance Report, which is FRPPR. So the goal of this documentation is to ensure everyone is transparent about the sources of their funding, make sure that new projects do not overlap with existing projects. You might have also heard the term double dipping. And so this is when you get funds from two sources to pay for the same thing. And again, because NIH funds are taxpayer dollars, the NIH is really accountable to the public for making sure that this doesn't happen. So when talking about who needs to provide other support documentation, we usually just say all key personnel, but there are a few exceptions. So one is training faculty on D43 grants or other training awards. Also, key personnel who are designated as other significant contributors do not have to provide this. And anyone, when you submit a progress report, if someone has not had a change in their other support since the last time it was submitted, you do not have to resubmit it for that person. So usually what we do at Vanderbilt is we send the previously submitted other support document back to the investigator and say, have you had any changes? And if so, can you please update this form? And that seems to be the easiest rather than having someone reinvent it each time. So the NIH defines the scope of what they want in the other support document as all resources available to a researcher in support of research. And that second part is really key. So it's important to note that this is limited to only funds supporting any kinds of research endeavors, not necessarily the research proposed in the proposal, but any of their research overall. So this includes resources and financial support, whether it's foreign or domestic, any personnel support, lab, clinical provisions, consulting agreements that include research, and any in-kind contributions supported by an outside source. This is something that was not previously documented through other support. And so this is something we'll talk about in a little more detail. And this can include office or lab space, equipment, supplies, personnel. So you might be thinking that's a pretty extensive list, and it is. But the answer is that some things are also not included in other support. And so this includes funds for non-research purposes. So clinical funding, teaching funding, administrative roles. This can all be omitted. Institutional support for core services or broadly available shared equipment like a computer lab, that does not need to be included. Consulting that is done for non-research purposes. So if there is no research in the scope of work, then the consulting does not need to be included. Gifts do not need to be included, but they can only be classified as gifts if there is no expectation of time or services. So if it's a gift, but there are expectations that you're going to provide something in return, then that is considered an in-kind contribution instead. So that is reportable. And then also not reported on other support are training awards, prizes, funding to support mentoring, grant writing, those kinds of things. So anything not related to research. So there are three types of overlap the NIH is really trying to assess with an other support document. So this is budgetary, scientific, and commitment overlap. And so these will be addressed by the investigator in an actual statement that's entitled overlap at the end of the document. And if any exist, they have to be resolved between the applicant and the funding agency at the time that the grant is awarded. So we're going to discuss what each of these mean. So budgetary overlap. So this is when you have funding from two sources that propose to pay for the same thing. A new computer, a freezer for a laboratory, staff salaries, and the list goes on. So if you have proposed funds in your budget for something, they need to be distinct from the things you already have funding for. So this can happen sometimes. We see it a lot with investigators who submit a lot of grants because they want to ensure they have funds to do their work. It takes a long time for grants to get funded. They know that not every grant they submit will get funded, so they might submit it in more than one place. If they hit the jackpot and multiple grants get funded at once, you may see budgetary overlap that needs to be addressed. Scientific overlap can occur for the same reason. So multiple applications might be submitted simultaneously to ensure a project gets funded. But if the research, even if one aim of a proposal is being funded, is similar to one that is already funded, this is considered scientific overlap. And it can be addressed a number of ways. The program staff at NIH may reduce the new award to remove the funding associated with this aim that's already been done. But so this isn't a deal breaker to have overlap, so don't ever hesitate to report it transparently and appropriately, because you can work with your staff members at the NIH to really address this. Whoops, sorry. Commitment overlap is the one that is honestly most likely to occur. That's the one we see most often, because investigators become involved in multiple projects and collaborations. But this is if their effort, including all of their reported other support, exceeds 100% effort, so 12 calendar months. And you'll see how it's reported in just a moment. And so it can take some time to resolve this one, because NIH approval is sometimes required to reduce efforts on projects to be able to juggle everything at once. So especially if an individual is in a key role like a PI or a multiple PI. And so it's important to note this, obviously, in the other support, but also be prepared to address it. So now that you know the purpose of the other support document, let's look at how they're constructed. So as I mentioned, these are substantially changing in January of 2022. Unfortunately, we expect that this will be more work for all research administrators, but it does seem particularly disadvantageous for our international partners. Some of you may have much more work to do with these, as if your jobs weren't busy enough already. So I'm including a few key points here about the new format. So similar to the previous format, you're including current and pending support. You do not include recently completed support. The individual must have an electronic signature at the bottom of the document, and the institution is responsible for maintaining documentation that confirms that this was actually signed by the right person. What we think is going to be one of the big ones here is that copies of contracts or agreements for any foreign employment must be included. And so this refers to anything outside of the applicant's institution. So if you apply as a prime institution, the employment contracts for your own institution are not required, but anything outside your institution is required. But if you're going to be part of a subcontract to a US institution, for instance, if Vanderbilt is reaching out to the University of Zambia to be a sub-award, then the University of Zambia's employment contracts have to be included here. So if the agreements are not in English, a translated version and the original version have to be included. NIH has said it is fine to use a machine translation version, but you have to make sure that it's correct. Unfortunately, the NIH does specifically state that the costs to translate these contracts cannot be directly billed to a grant. So they have to be paid with indirect costs, which we know are limited, or funded from another source. So unfortunately, that we know is going to be time consuming and burdensome for many of you. Both direct and indirect costs need to be included for the entire project period. But if your institution is receiving a subcontract and the other institution is the prime, then you will report the name of the project, the name of the PI, and the grant number for the prime award, but you only include the amount for your institution, the amount of dollars to your institution. You do not need to, so for consulting, the amount that you have is shown as a total amount, not as a % effort or calendar months, and it does not actually count towards your total effort. When you have anything listed on your other support, you must either put a % effort or a dollar value in US dollars, and an estimate is okay in many cases. But you can't have both be zero. You can list both if you have an effort and a dollar amount, but you can't list neither. So you have to have either effort or dollar value listed. So this is an example. This section captures the other support associated with grants or research awards. So you'll see that if you've done this before, you'll see that this format is different than other support, how it's been requested in the past. So now moving forward, each project or proposal has its own listing that looks like this. So it should look similar to the example you see here. This template is available on the website that you have and that we will put again in the resources section. But you can see that this is something that you'll just copy and repeat for each project. This is an example of an active, ongoing research project. You can see pending on the next slide. I'll show you pending projects. But you can see here that they list their effort for each of in-person months for each of the years of the award and the total amount of the grant. And again, that's direct and indirect costs now. And when you are adding up your effort across projects to ensure that an investigator is not over that 100% effort or 12 calendar months, you do not need to include pending awards. So this shows an example of the projects and proposal pending section for grants that have been submitted but are not yet funded. And so you can see here, these are things that you'd also want to address in the overlap section if there's, in case a pending grant did get funded, how you would adjust your support accordingly if needed. This section is very new. This is not something that we've been reporting before in other support. And so this is an example of other support associated with in-kind contributions. And as I mentioned earlier, you can see that there's a dollar value associated with this, but not effort. And so remember that you can't have dollar value and effort be zero. So for these, you'd put a dollar value. And so you can see what kinds of examples they have. So this person has a postdoctoral fellow working in their lab, conducting research, and their salary is supported by an external university. So, or even an internal university, it's still considered an in-kind contribution. And so you can see here that this is the amount that person gets paid. And so you can see here, if cell lines are provided, or in this case, animal models are provided, this is how they would be written. And you can see that where they've written what the actual funds are versus where they have estimates. And so estimates are fine. The NIH and the reviewers will understand for sure that not all of these things have set dollar values. You're also estimating the dollar value at the time that you're submitting this. I'm aware that many of our partners and countries are having lots of issues with inflation and changes in conversions to US dollars. Use the amount at the time of submission and move forward from there. You don't have to worry about that if that changes, that you've under or over reported something. So finally, every other support document, after you finish the project proposal section and the in-kind contribution section, it must close with an overlap statement. And it might say something like the examples shown here. Or if there isn't overlap, it can just simply say there is no scientific or budgetary overlap, or none is expected. But it's the responsibility of the PI to certify that this statement is true to the best of their knowledge, and then they digitally sign it. And so just to reiterate that, so the document has to be digitally signed and dated using an approved signature software through the institution. They cannot just type a name or photocopy a name in here. It has to be an actual digital signature software. It's the responsibility of the institution to verify that the PI is actually the one who signed it, and to keep that record in case it is something that is discoverable in the case that someone is to audit this. So penalties for non-compliance, including failure to disclose, can result in PIs or institutions losing funding or future eligibility for grants. So if you learn of something that should have been disclosed, but it wasn't, not if something new comes up, that's different. But if something at the time of submission wasn't disclosed and you find out about it later, you have 30 days from when you learn about it to report it to your grants management specialist and your PO. And so report that right away to the NIH, submit a revised document, and that's fine. Disclosing as soon as you know about it is certainly a show of good faith as opposed to waiting till day 30 to submit it. So you'll have to tell them at the time, we learned about this, last week, and here's the new updated document, and that's totally fine. We did ask how these will be reviewed at NIH, and the answer is they're still working on it. So, so I would expect that the guidance will continue to evolve. There are some excellent, there's an excellent section online about frequently asked questions about other support that I'll include as well. It answered a lot of my own questions about what's going to be required in the new other support documents for our investigators. And I'm hoping that you'll find it a helpful resource as well. So we're going to do a quick quiz. So I'm hoping that you're paying attention because here we go. Let me see if I can launch this. Quick quiz, here we go. Okay, so a principal investigator has asked you to complete their other support document and ensure it's compliant. So which of the following of these should be included? Please make sure you select all of them that apply. So a consultant role on a funded research project, a PI role on a project that ended in the last 3 years, funding for a postdoc working on their team on the proposed project, and funding for a postdoc working on their team on a different project. And can you see it? Can you see the poll? Oh, there we go. Okay, we see some answers coming in. I'll give you just a few moments. Remember, you can select multiple answers. So. Okay. All right, let's leave that. I like it. Thank you for answering. That's good. Got 15 responses. 16, 17. All right. Okay. I'm going to end it there. Okay. Can you see the results? Wait, hold on. I think I have to share them. Okay, if you can see those results. So the answer on this, can you see those results? I'm going to put it here just in case. So for the first one, the consultant role is for research. That should definitely be included. So 16 out of 18, that's great. So yes, that one is a yes. For the second one, a PI role on a project that ended in the last 3 years. So recently completed projects are no longer included as other support. So that one's actually a no. Funding for a postdoc working on research, regardless of which project it is, must be included. So if they are working on research that supports the investigator's overall research portfolio, they're working in their lab, they're working on their team on a different project, it must be included. So the answers to 3 and 4 are actually both yes. So I did put that one in there to trick you. So I apologize for tricking you. But so if you have individuals in your lab as well who are funded by a foreign institution, this is really common practice, especially for a lot of organizations in China and the Middle East tend to send their scholars to other institutions to further their training. And so this also needs to be included here. So you would list that you have a postdoc working in your group and they're working, and here's who they're funded by, and here's how much money they get. And so that's all important to make sure is included. So we'll close that one out. So that was great. Let's do. So there is no time like the present to get started on these other support documents. As I mentioned, these are different than the ones that have been collected previously, substantially different. And we think they will take a considerable amount of time for some investigators to actually build these and complete these with their research administrators. So for faculty with existing projects, these new documents will be needed for all upcoming progress reports. So you can prioritize based on when these progress reports might be due, but I would certainly start collecting this information for other support for each of these individuals. Also recognize that it can change quite rapidly for investigators who are involved in a lot of projects. And so make sure that you verify before you send it out, is this your most recent version? Is this all correct? For faculty with pending projects that receive fundable scores when they're reviewed, don't wait for the just-in-time request to come from NIH. If you get a score of 12 on a grant, you are likely to get funded. So go ahead and start getting this other support in place. This has a very fast turnaround. These just-in-time requests sometimes come through with just a couple weeks, or I mean, I've seen them even come through faster than that. So make sure that you're ready to respond and have this other support ready. In both cases, I would certainly prioritize agreements that need translation, because you want to make sure that you have the English versions of contracts and agreements in place. Make sure you document everything carefully and keep versions of these other support documents on hand so you can just update them each time rather than starting from the beginning. And then you can find the current template. There's a Word template currently available on the NIH website. They're actually going to put a Science CV. We talked about Science CV for BioSketches. They will have a Science CV template for other support available in early 2022. And so similar to BioSketches, it is anticipated that this will be a more efficient way to maintain and update information for each of your research administrators. So again, if this is something you will be doing frequently, you might want to look at that option when it comes out, and we can notify you all on the WhatsApp when we see it. But this is the website where you can find information about other support, and we will share some more as well. But let me stop there. And this is the end of the other support section. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and then we'll take a brief break before launching into topic 2. Daphne, I can see your hand is up.
Thank you so much, Donna. This, especially the other support for me is always a bit of a nightmare. So